Hello, everybody. This is Bud Reiser from the National Christina Foundation, your host for today's webinar. Let me give you a little background information on how things are set up here. We had a great response, and people are still logging in. If everybody who signs up attends, we'll be close to 30 people, which is wonderful. It's great to know this topic is of such importance. So, but because there's so many people, the only two people who you will hear today will be myself as I make the introduction and kind of set the format, and then our presenter, Pico Mitchell of Free Geek. You have available to you through the system the ability to type in question. You can type questions at any time you want. We're going to hold off toward the end of the webinar, and then I can present those questions to Pico. I'm recording this webinar. It's already under the recording process because I was contacted by a number of people who said that they were unable to be sitting in the right place at this time. So it will be recorded. So the last thing to share with you is if you are listening to this on a phone system that has the ability that you might have to put it on hold or go to another line, sometimes when that happens, you might have background music that's generated, and in the past, sometimes that music seemed to find its way into these calls. So if that happens, please make sure your phone really is muted, or if you have to, just hang up from this call and then call back into the number you already have. We had to actually reboot a webinar the last time because of this. So that being said, I am now going to push a few magic buttons here and make Pico the presenter, and in a moment here, he will be prompted that the screen is his, and now I need to go one step further and give him the, appears that he is self-muted at this point, so you might have to unmute yourself, Pico. I think you may have done so. Yeah, there you are. I can hear you, and at this point, I'm going to just slide off to the side and turn it over to you. Welcome, Pico. Thank you for being with us. Thanks for taking the time to make this presentation.
Thank you. So my name is Pico Mitchell. I work here at Free Geek in IT and mobile devices and in Macland. Thank you all so much for joining me for this iOS device refurbishment webinar. I'm really excited to get to share this information about the IPSW updater tool we made and to share our processes using Apple Configurator that's helped save us a ton of time. Before we start, I wanted to let you know that I ended up pre-recording this thing and combining all the best takes. It's just a lot of information, and I really wanted to make sure to include everything and get it all right for you. I also want to thank Daniel Bartholomew, our executive director here at Free Geek. It was originally his idea to do this, so thank you. Also want to thank Bud Reiser for setting everything up and promoting the webinar. So this is going to be pretty much a full hour, so we're just going to jump right in and get started.
So the first thing I'd like to talk about is this really important question of how secure is Apple's normal iOS restore process. This is a really important question because we want to know that when somebody donates an iOS device to us and we erase their data off of it, that data is gone forever, that nobody can get at that using any means. This is important for any data-bearing devices that are donated to us. So when I was searching for information about this, it was a little bit difficult to find because a lot of the information is more written for users that say they have their data on their device, it's protected by a passcode, and they lose that device, or that device is stolen. How secure is that situation? Can anybody break through their passcode? Can anybody read their data any other way? But that's not what we're concerned about. We're concerned about once a device has already been erased, what techniques were used, and is there any way that that data can be recovered? I found this iOS security guide, which covers a lot of this information and a lot more security information about iOS system and devices in general. I recommend checking that out if you're curious. And I also have this, our summary, the second link there, the Google Doc link, is basically just excerpts from the iOS security guide that cover the important points of erasing iOS devices. So this all gets pretty technical, and I don't want to get too bogged down in all of that. So I'm going to try to keep things simple and probably oversimplify things to make it brief and understandable. But the overall rundown of this is all iOS devices use solid-state drives, and wiping solid-state drives or deleting data from solid-state drives in general is not the same as deleting data from traditional spinning hard drives. And a lot of the techniques used to erase traditional spinning hard drives don't work when erasing data from an SSD. The key reasons for this, things to look into more, are wear leveling and over provisioning. And like I said, I don't want to get into all that, but basically these things mean that when data is written to an SSD, it may not be just written once. It may be written in multiple places. And when you erase that data, not all instances of that data may be gone. But there may still be bits of information there, even after you think it's been erased. So one accepted technique for deleting data from an SSD is to encrypt that data from the beginning, and then when you want to delete it, you destroy the encryption key. And so this is the technique that Apple's employing with their iOS devices. And to do this, all modern iOS devices have built-in hardware encryption. That's the iPhone 3GS and newer, the iPod Touch 3rd generation and newer, and all iPads. Now, sadly, I couldn't find this list directly from Apple. It's not in the iOS security guide, but I did find this list in a variety of places when searching on the internet, and it's also listed in this Stack Exchange link here, which is just a good breakdown of how the encryption works on iOS devices and how they're erased. So that's nothing official, but it's just a good, understandable breakdown of this process. So this encryption is not, there's multiple layers of encryption on iOS devices, but this level of encryption, the iOS security guide states that the device encryption is not a user setting. It's not tied to your passcode. It can't be turned off. All the data on all these iOS devices that we're dealing with all have encryption that's always enabled. So we know that when we use the standard erase all content and settings or restoring the device through iTunes or Apple Configurator, that those encryption keys are destroyed and that data is gone forever. Now, it's another important question about, so if these encryption keys are stored on this SSD, how do we know that those encryption keys, that the previous encryption keys are actually gone forever because of wear leveling and over provisioning and all that? To address this issue, Apple has a special section of the SSD, which they call effaceable storage. And you can read more about this in the iOS security guide, but essentially they have a section of the SSD that doesn't do any wear leveling, so that they know that when they write the encryption keys to this area, that's the only place that they exist. And when they erase those encryption keys or overwrite those encryption keys in the effaceable storage area, that they're gone forever. So that is effectively losing the encryption keys for good. So the data is encrypted from the beginning, and then when the device is restored or erased, those keys are destroyed. And then there's a little bit more information about how the file system is encrypted. And like I said, there's multiple layers of encryption going on. I don't want to get too deeply into that, but basically they talk about in the iOS security guide how all file metadata is encrypted with a random key, and then also all the file contents are encrypted. And those keys are stored with those encryption keys for the contents are stored within the metadata, and the metadata is again encrypted as well. So very secure system. And also I want to point out, so this is talked about in the security guide and in the Stack Exchange link there. Not the entire disk isn't encrypted, but all of the user data is in a separate partition that's encrypted. So the operating system is on one partition and the user data is on another. And all this stuff Apple did to make it really quick and really easy to securely erase an iOS device. This is how, when you click erase all content and settings in the device itself, it's able to destroy all the user data, but not destroy the operating system because they're separated. These are also the features that allow people to erase their device remotely, whether that's enterprise situations where a corporation wants to be able to just erase devices once an employee no longer works for the company or a device has been lost, and users can also do this through iCloud. So that's just a brief rundown of this security information for restoring iOS devices. I definitely recommend, do your own research, learn enough to know for yourself that you're comfortable with the way that Apple is erasing iOS devices. So I don't intend this to be like the definitive guide or that you should trust everything I say here. I think that this is stuff that everybody should investigate on their own and come to their own conclusions, but this is what we're doing. So we're going to just, from this point on, we're just talking about the normal iOS restore techniques through the device itself, through iTunes, or through Apple Configurator. Next up, I'd like to introduce IPSW Updater. Now, this is an app that I made to solve a problem we would run into pretty regularly, and that's that whenever you restore an iOS device using iTunes or Apple Configurator, those apps always check for the latest version of iOS and download it automatically if that file doesn't already exist. And this is a big hassle because there's not just one firmware file to download for each version of iOS. There's about a dozen different firmware files for all these different groups of devices for every minor version that comes out. And while it is possible to manually select an older version of iOS to restore through iTunes, that's difficult because the firmware file names are kind of cryptic. It's hard to know which file goes to the device you're restoring. Also, that can't be done forever because Apple signs these firmware files, basically validating them. And then when a new version comes out, after a while, the old version is no longer signed and can no longer be installed. So before we had IPSW Updated to do all this for us, we would try to manually pre-download all of the firmware files whenever an update came out and put them in the right place for iTunes to find them and share them between our multiple computers that we would use to restore iOS devices. And it was just a really big headache. We would dread it whenever an iOS update came out, which might be once a month, but sometimes is once every couple of weeks if there's some minor bug fixes going on. So once we just got totally tired of doing that, I finally started working on a script to basically check for updates regularly and download all of the updates whenever they came out. And over time, this became more and more robust and more user-friendly and gave better feedback about what it was doing and was set up in a way that was more generalized, not just made specifically for how FreeGeek is doing things, but made in a way that we could share it with other people doing the same iOS refurbishment work. So that's where we're at now. So I'd like to jump over and show you all IPSW Updater. So here we are in Safari going to ipsw.app/download, and this is where you can go to download the latest version of IPSW Updater. The rest of ipsw.app is not set up yet. That'll just forward to freegeek.org. This is the only part of the site that's set up for you to be able to download IPSW Updater a little bit early. So we can see that the zip file is downloaded. We're just going to click that to open it up and unarchive the application. Now we're double clicking IPSW Updater to open it up. We're seeing the standard macOS security warning. Just click through that. Now we can see that IPSW Updater can install itself into the applications folder, which is where it should be. So it's detected that it's running from the downloads folder, and that's not quite right. So it can just move itself over to the applications folder. We're going to let it do that. And then we'll see that IPSW Updater relaunches itself from the applications folder. Just double checking, yep, that it's in there where it should be. We can also launch it from Launchpad. So this first thing that you're going to see is this welcome window, which just gives you an overview of what IPSW Updater is going to do. I also want to point out there towards the top, you can see that IPSW Updater uses the IPSW Downloads API from ipsw.me that's made by Just a Penguin. That's really an invaluable resource for us. IPSW Updater couldn't exist without it. We would previously use ipsw.me to find all those latest download links to pre-download all the latest firmware files before we had IPSW Updater doing it for us. So the rest of this is talking about how IPSW Updater sort of takes over management of your iTunes software updates folders, which is where iTunes looks for the latest firmware files. It's also where Apple Configurator looks for the latest firmware files. So IPSW Updater is just going to put the files right where they should be. Whenever any updates are downloaded, IPSW Updater will trash the older versions so you don't have extra space used on your machine. You will need to empty the trash manually whenever IPSW Updater trashes something to totally get rid of that data, but it's just made to keep things nice and organized for you. Also towards the bottom there, you'll see that IPSW Updater can also check for app updates for itself. So it'll check for those each time it runs. So I built in automatic updating to this so that whenever I release a update for bug fixes or new features, those will get installed automatically and you'll never need to worry about that. So to use IPSW Updater, we've got to agree to all this with that button there. And then we'll set up some preferences. So I recommend reading through all this later on. But right now we're just going to agree and start setting up these preferences. So the first thing that we're going to see is the product exclusion option. So if you're not working with any one of these or any 2 or 3 of these kinds of devices, you can exclude them. So if you're only working with iPhones, you could exclude Apple TVs, iPads, and iPod Touches. Right now, we're just going to exclude Apple TVs because that's the only thing that doesn't apply to what we're talking about right now. We're just going to be dealing with iPads, iPhones, and iPod Touches. So we're going to save that exclusion and move on. The next thing is we can limit which versions of iOS IPSW Updater downloads. If you're only dealing with the latest and greatest stuff, you can download iOS 10 and newer or iOS 11 and newer, whatever makes sense for you. We're going to stick with iOS 7 and newer because that basically just downloads everything that we may want. You'll also see this note up here that Apple Configurator only supports iOS 7 and newer. So if you are dealing with older devices for some reason, remember some of those may not have hardware encryption. But also you'll have to do those one at a time through iTunes. So you won't be able to use the Apple Configurator techniques that we'll be going over shortly. So we're just going to save that setting. And next, we're going to set up auto launch. And this is really what makes IPSW Updater truly useful, is that it can run all the time without you having to worry about it. Once you go through these preferences, you basically never need to do anything with IPSW Updater again. So we can set it to launch on any day or any days. We're going to keep this set to every day because even though there are standards of when iOS updates usually come out, you never really know. Sometimes there's security fixes that come out on random days. So there's no harm in having it check every day. So we're just going to stick with that. The next thing is selecting the time that we want IPSW Updater to launch. And so you can select whatever makes sense for you. We're going to stick at 6:30 here because Free closes at 6. So we know by 6:30, pretty much everyone's out of the building. All the volunteers are out of the building. The internet's going to be nice and fast and nobody's going to be around to accidentally interrupt this process. So you can pick whatever makes sense for you. Then we see this, which is talking about a power schedule. So this is a cool thing that Macs can do. It's all using built-in stuff to basically have the computer turn itself on at a set time. So this is offering to have the computer turn itself on 15 minutes before whatever auto launch time we just selected. This is something that you can see in the system preferences. In the energy saver section of the system preferences, you'll see a schedule button, which is where these settings will be available, or where you could set it yourself manually. If you don't want IPSW Updater to do it for you, but we're just going to go ahead and let IPSW Updater do it for us. So we'll need to put in our admin password to be able to run this command. And then next, IPSW Updater detected that the current user doesn't have automatic login enabled. And this is really important because if the computer gets shut down, we now set it to turn itself back on. But if automatic login isn't enabled, then it's just going to sit on the login screen an IPSW updater won't be able to run. So if it makes sense for you and you want to make sure that IPSW updater can always launch, I recommend turning on automatic login. So here, there's that convenient button to jump straight to the correct section in the system preferences. And now we've got to unlock this preference pane. And then you'll see we can get into this automatic login dropdown, select our user, put in our password again to confirm automatic login. And now we're done in the system preferences. So we can go back to IPSW Updater, click through this, and now we're on the startup window. That shows us an overview of the preferences, all the preferences that we just set, and a button. You can see there's a button there to edit those preferences if you ever want to change anything later. Towards the top of this window, you'll see that there's a firmware updates overview that shows that IPSW Updater is never checked for updates, but normally that'll show you the last time that it checked for updates, and then it'll also show you the last time that IPSW Updater downloaded anything, showing how many files were downloaded, how many gigabytes, which versions were downloaded, all of that. If there were any errors recently, it'll also show you any errors that happened. And you'll see at the very top of this window that IPSW Updater will start in 45 seconds. So this is all set up to not need any user interaction. So when IPSW Updater launches automatically, it'll sit here for 45 seconds and then it'll just start working. So you don't need to be there to click start now or anything. But let's click start now and see what IPSW Updater looks like. So the first thing we're going to see is that it quickly loads up all that information from IPSW.me and then starts finding that a bunch of updates are available. This is moving really quick because there are no updates downloaded already. So this is just the initial run. I got this pause here for a second. Normally it doesn't take so long to initialize a download, but I just wanted to say that first loading window will take a bit longer if you've already got a bunch of stuff downloaded, because it actually verifies every firmware file every time. So it does checksum verifications to make sure that the files downloaded are the correct files. If anything was corrupted or incomplete or just, whatever, it'll trash the incorrect file and it'll re-download the correct file from Apple. So now we can see that IPSW Updater just starts downloading. Our internet's not moving super fast right now, and I don't want to wait for all these downloads. So we're just going to skip this. You can skip just one update, or we can skip all the remaining updates. So we're just going to skip everything. And now that's going to go to the results window. And so normally you'll see a nice breakdown of all of the updates that were downloaded, how many files were downloaded, how many gigabytes, how long it took, which versions, all of that. So that's something for you to get to see when you run IPSW Updater yourself. I also want to point out that when IPSW Updater runs and there are no updates, this window won't stay open. It'll close automatically after 30 minutes. So if it's running overnight, it'll sit on that results for 30 minutes. If nothing happened, then it'll close it. So when you come back to the computer in the morning, it won't be there to bother you. You'll only see the IPSW Updater results if something downloaded. It'll stay open for you to acknowledge those updates and see that everything's working properly. Also, if there were any errors or anything, it'll stay open for you to see that. But let's just quit out of this and move on. That's IPSW Updater. All right, so let's get into Apple Configurator. Now, you may not have heard of Apple Configurator before. I definitely hadn't heard of it until I started doing this research to find what other ways could we wipe iOS devices. So you may be wondering, why can't we just use iTunes? And the main reason for that is because iTunes can only restore one iOS device at a time. Apple Configurator can batch restore iOS devices, which is great, but Apple Configurator can go even farther and pre-configure those iOS devices to skip setup screens and to pre-installer testing apps. And this was a huge time savings for us so that we wouldn't have to tap through all the same setup screens and install our testing apps just so that we could start testing a device. So to run Apple Configurator, you can get it free on the Mac App Store, but you will need an Apple ID. You can create that without a credit card if needed, which is nice. And you'll need a Mac that can run macOS Sierra 10.12.5 or later. I'll show you which Macs can run that towards the end of this presentation. There's a link to where you can download Apple Configurator, but for now, let's just jump over to this demo. So here we are in the Mac App Store. You'll see I'm going to sign in with my Apple ID to download this here, and then you'll see the installation go really fast because I cut away that progress. so we wouldn't have to wait for it. Now we could open Apple Configurator from the App Store, but we can also open it from Launchpad or in your Applications folder. So let's accept this to get started. And now the first thing I'm going to do is to go into the Apple Configurator preferences, and I'm going to set some sounds to play on completion and on warning. And the reason I do this is because Apple Configurator does a great job, but it's not really made to work exactly the way that we want it to work. One thing that it's really lacking is nice results. So a lot of what I'm going to show you is kind of how to bend Apple Configurator to our will so that it gives us more results, more feedback than it normally would. One of the things that's nice is for it to play a nice success sound when things work properly and an error sound when something went wrong. You can pick whichever sounds you want. Those are ones that just sound good to me. Next, I'm going to customize the toolbar here. So I right-click on that toolbar, click Customize Toolbar, and now I'm just getting rid of a bunch of stuff that we're not going to need. Adding in activity and info, which can be handy, and then just the plain restore action, which can be handy sometimes. And now I'm plugging in a couple devices. So let's see how this looks. So there's one, and here's the other. And one thing that's nice is to go into the View menu and turn on the status bar there. That's really nice because if you've got a bunch of devices plugged in, you know you've got 10 devices on the desk, it's nice to know that, okay, all 10 devices showed up in Apple Configurator, and that status bar makes that really simple. Now this view, this collection view is nice, but it doesn't give us a lot of detail, so let's switch over to the list view, make this window a bit bigger. And now, like the toolbar, there's a bunch of columns here in this list that we don't really need, so I'm going to go in, I'm going to remove a bunch of these columns and add stuff that'll be useful for us. I'm going to hop back over here real quick. So you'll see some dense slides like that that are just showing everything that I'm doing in this demo. So those slides we're just going to skip right past. Those are there just for your reference later on. If you don't want to have to rewatch the whole presentation, you can just go into the slides and find exactly what I'm doing here to set up Apple Configurator. So now we're going to select the devices we want to restore, and we could just use this plain old restore feature, but if we do that, the device will just end up being called iPhone. And we can see that one of those is already called iPhone, so if it starts called iPhone and it ends up being called iPhone, we don't really know for certain that we wiped this device. And we want to know that even if a device comes in already wiped, that we wiped it ourselves. So how we can do that is to set up a really simple blueprint. So let's click that Blueprints menu, Edit Blueprints, and now we're going to create a new one with that button down on the bottom left. We're going to call it Erase and Rename. Now double click that to start editing it. So you'll see the target is set to iPad, iPhone, and iPod Touch. We're just going to keep it that way. That's what we're working with. Apple TVs are a little different. So let's set up a setup action. So you see I go into the Actions menu here, and I'm going to select Restore. And so this is just going to do the same thing as the Restore button in the toolbar, the same thing as if you restored the device through the device itself. So now we can see an erase and restore to latest OS. Next up, I want to rename it. So Actions menu, Modify, Device Name. So I'm going to call it FG SDA, that's Free Geek Secure Data Area, cleared, and then I'm going to add the type and the serial number. And adding the serial number is really nice because it makes every device name unique. And you'll see why that's handy later on. So obviously you can call these device names whatever you want. I recommend including the type and the serial number there just so that it's clear which one is which and that they're all unique. You'll also see in the blueprint that there's a section for apps and profiles. We're not going to do anything with that right now. This is all we're doing with this simple erase and rename blueprint. So let's give this a go. As a reminder here, you do need to select the devices you want to work with. So we're selecting these two devices, go into the Blueprints menu, select Erase and Rename, and apply that. And so you'll notice, oh, we got to agree the first time we install this firmware. So you'll notice that the first step is always going to be downloading iOS. And I talk about that in this next slide over here, which is, again, just for your reference, just showing exactly what I'm doing in this demo. So first step will always be downloading iOS. It's not actually downloading anything. It's just verifying that the file exists and that it's the correct file. So you'll always see that, but it's not downloading anything. IPSW Updater already took care of all that for us. Now you'll see this install process go really fast because I trimmed it away so we wouldn't have to wait for it. And now we'll see these names should be changed, but they're not changed yet. Okay, now one changed and the other one didn't. So this is a common bug that happens in Apple Configurator, and it's easy to deal with because we want to know that these devices got erased and renamed by us. We might think there's an error going on if something didn't get renamed, but first let's use this refresh option in the view menu. Okay, so now we can see that both devices were properly renamed. So you'll probably run into that. Just refresh the list. You can also use the Command R shortcut, which you'll see me do here. The list will flash for a second. So I just refresh that. So yeah, now this is basically our results list. Even though Apple Configurator doesn't give us any results breakdown, renaming the devices gives us a way to see exactly what worked and what didn't. And one last thing I'm going to do here is make this model column nice and wide. I forgot to do that earlier. That's nice because when you've got the progress sheet shown there, it blocks those other columns, the capacity, serial number, and all that. So it's nice to make the model column nice and wide so that we can still see all of the other columns while the progress is running. You'll see why that's handy later on. All right, so back over to our slide. So you already saw all of this information. Again, just for your reference, you'll see more slides like this that I'm not going to talk about in detail because it's just showing everything I'm doing in the demos. So that's the basic setup for Apple Configurator. It's just that easy to set it up and start batch wiping iOS devices, but we can do even more. So now let's see how we set up a more advanced blueprint. So here's another really dense slide. I'm not going to read through all of this. I'm just going to show you in this demo. So let's hop over there. So here we are back in Apple Configurator. And so we want to make a new blueprint. So back to that edit blueprints, new, and we're going to call this one prepare for testing. Again, double click that to start editing it. Going to leave the target the same, and we're going to go back into this actions menu where we selected restore before, but we don't want to wipe the device again. We already know that the device is wiped. We want to prepare it. So click prepare, not restore, prepare. So you'll see here, there's a bunch of stuff. You can read this in more detail, but we don't need to do anything with these first three options here. We just want the setup assistant options. So we can choose to only show some steps. So we're only going to choose to show the location services. And the reason we do this is because we need the location services to be enabled to test GPS. And if we don't see that on the setup screen, then we have to go back into the settings app, tap more stuff to be able to turn on location services. When we keep it in the setup screen, it's really nice and easy just to tap once to enable it and be done with it. You'll see that later on. So now we can see that all these steps are skipped. So we're going to go back in like we did before and change the device name again. So now we want it to be called FG Mobile Testing. Again, you can call it whatever you like. Okay, so we're basically, this is pretty much what we did before. Instead of restore, we did prepare and we renamed the device. But now let's get into some more fun stuff. So let's add some apps. Let's pre-add some apps. You will need to sign in to your App Store account, same one we used to install Apple Configurator. And then you'll see a list of apps that are available. And these, you can't search the App Store through this. You can't get apps through Apple Configurator. So these are all apps that I've already downloaded onto an iOS device. So if you're starting from nothing, you'll need to sign into your App Store account on an iPhone or an iPad or something, find the testing apps you want, download them, and then once you've already got those on your account, then they'll show up in this list in Apple Configurator. So we're going to add these. And so you'll see I'm using apps called TestM, Phone Check, Mobile Assist Lite, and Mac Tracker. TestM and Phone Check are very similar apps. The main difference is that Phone Check is optimized for iPad, where TestM isn't. So when you're doing a touchscreen test on an iPad, TestM doesn't take up the full screen, so you're not really testing as much of the touch screen as you can. Phone Check does take up the full screen on an iPad, so that's why we've got that. It's also nice to have two really similar apps so that in case you see some weird behavior on some test, you can go into another app and run the same test and see if anything weird's going on there too, whether it's the hardware or just one of these apps being funky. Next up, we've got Mobile Assist Lite. This is really not a great app. We just use it for a nice, convenient screen color test. So not the touch screen, but just the visual screen test. So it's just solid colors, red, green, yellow, blue, white, black, all that, just so you can see if there's any dark spots or light spots or discoloration around the edges to make note of. And then lastly, there's Mac Tracker. And this is really just like a database of every Apple device ever made. And there's a quick option to show all the specs for this device. So all the configuration options that were available, the hardware that it's using, the processor, all that. It's not something we use often, but it's nice to just have a reference if you're curious, all the specs of the device you're working with. One last thing to mention about TestM and Phone Check is that TestM has Bluetooth tests where Phone Check doesn't. So if I'm testing iPad, I'll be using Phone Check, but after I'm done, I'm going to go into TestM just to do their Bluetooth test since we don't have that in Phone Check. Now, we're going to go and change up the home screen a little bit. So this is really convenient. Now that we've installed these apps, we might want them to be a little more conveniently accessible on our device. So I want to add them all to the dock there at the bottom. And while this is really convenient, this is the buggiest part of Apple Configurator, regrettably. So you'll see some weird stuff here. But first, I'm going to just move everything out of the dock. So you'll see I hover over that first home screen and a bunch of apps reappeared. I actually did that on purpose because before it wasn't showing all the apps. The settings app wasn't anywhere, and I want to put that in the dock. So that I happened to notice was a way to trick it to bring all those icons back so that I could drag settings here in a moment. So right now I'm just removing everything from the dock so that I can add my stuff back. So first I'm going to add settings. Next I'm going to add mobile assistant light. And we can see it doesn't show up in the dock, but it's actually there. We can see it takes up a space. That's just one of the bugs that we'll see. And again, same issue, but if we click apply and then go back into actions, modify home screen layout, we can see that all those apps actually are in the dock. If I move something around, the same thing happens. It's not visible, but it's actually there. We can see that that first home screen isn't showing enough icons properly again. So let's just apply it. And one last time, let's see how things are. All right, yeah, that's about good enough for what I'm gonna do right now. I don't wanna battle Apple Configurator as much as I did for our actual prepare and testing blueprint. You'll see over here, I have a breakdown at the bottom there. I went through the trouble of moving everything into a folder, into an unnecessary folder that we didn't want so that it could all be consolidated down to one home screen. So I left App Store, Camera, Voice Memos, Compass, Watch, Maps, Safari, and Mac Tracker on the home screen, and then I put everything else into an unnecessary folder. I figured those apps might be useful sometimes just to double check testing. Those are all things that access built-in hardware. And then in the dock, I have settings, TestM, Phone Check, and Mobile Assist Lite. So that's most of our Prepare for Testing blueprint, but we can actually do a little bit more. Using profiles, we can teach the devices our Wi-Fi password without ever having to type it in. So let's check that out in this demo. So here we are back in Apple Configurator. We can see everything set up just like we did before. Our home screen, our name, all our setup steps are skipped. We've got our apps installed. And now let's go to profiles. And you may just want to jump down and click add profiles, but we've actually got nothing to add yet. So we need to go to the file menu and select new profile to create a brand new profile. And first we're just going to set up the names. So we called ours Free Geek iOS Testing. And now you'll see on this identifier, they show an example of com.company.profile. That's a standard Mac naming convention internally. It's called reverse domain notation. So we're just going to copy that with org.freegeek.ios-testing. The organization is optional here, but we'll just say that we're Free Geek. And then everything else stays the same. We don't want to add any security or anything, so people can always remove this profile, but it all gets destroyed when the devices get reset at the end. Anyway, so we'll see there's a bunch of options here in the profile, and we're just going to go to Wi-Fi. That's all we're going to worry about. We don't need to do anything else. So click Configure, set your Wi-Fi name. We've got two Wi-Fi networks here at Free Geek. One is called Free Geek, and it's unlocks, and then we've got FG reuse, which is password protected and a whole lot faster. So we want to use that one for our testing. So we're going to put in our name and our password, and that's it. We don't need to change anything else. Now let's save this profile right onto the desktop. And now we can close it in Apple Configurator, and we can go back to that Add Profile button and add our profile from the desktop. So now we can see we've got that profile in Apple Configurator, and it's also still here on the desktop. And it's important to point out that these are not the same files anymore. Apple Configurator copies the profile into the blueprint. So the one on the desktop is not the same as the one in the blueprint. So if you want to change anything, that can be a little tricky. First, you might think that you want to double click the one on the desktop here, but you'll see if we do that, it's going to open System Preferences and try to install the profile onto this Mac. And we don't want to do that. So let's cancel that and close out of the System Preferences. What we need to do is reopen this profile in Apple Configurator. So I drag that down to the Apple Configurator icon in the dock is one way to open it. And now we can see our profile set up just like before. And so I realized, whoops, I put in the wrong Wi-Fi password. Let me change that to the correct password here and resave this profile. So now the one on the desktop has the correct password, but the one in the blueprint doesn't. So I need to go select that, go to the edit menu, and then delete it. You can also just use the delete key. There's also an option in the actions menu to remove profiles if you're not already on the profiles screen. So now, just like before, add profiles and select the profile from the desktop. Now I've got the profile with the correct Wi-Fi password in my blueprint. And that's it. So now we're going to click Done and see what it's like to install this blueprint. So remember, we've got to select our devices that we want to work with and back into this Blueprints menu and select Prepare for Testing. So this one's going to go quite a bit faster because it's not restoring, it's not erasing the devices. It's just installing this blueprint, which sets the home screen, skips the setup screens, and teaches it the Wi-Fi password. And we can see here on this progress window why it's nice to have that model column nice and wide because I can still see everything. And one thing that's really different about this blueprint versus the other one versus the erase and rename is that this one tries to activate the devices, because to skip the setup screen, it's got to go through activation. So that can cause more problems, and that's why it's nice to have these two profiles be separate, because we know that the first one, the erase and rename, shouldn't fail pretty much for any reason unless the device is messed up, where this one could fail if activation can't succeed, whether there's network issues, whether a device is missing a SIM card, or whether it's activation locked, which we'll talk more about. But let's see how this process goes here. We're waiting for the devices. We can see that we've got all of our columns visible. And now we're trying to activate, and we run into an issue, because I know that one of these devices actually is activation locked. I wanted to show you all what this looks like. So one thing that's nice here is that you'll see that the device name is listed in the alert. And that's why it's nice to have the serial number in the device name, is because now we know exactly which one is having trouble. We might know, okay, that's the 32 gig iPhone. I know which one that is on my desk, and I know what's what. But for now, we're just going to skip this and move on, because I know that's not going to work with this device. So I want just to let the other one get processed. We can see the name changed over there. Now we've got FG mobile testing and FG SDA cleared. And this is moving really fast because I cut away all that progress so we wouldn't have to wait for it. And that's it. So our results are basically just that our names are changed. And maybe if something didn't get renamed, you'll need to use that refresh command like before. But here we saw the names got changed properly, and we can see that one device worked and one device didn't. So here's another slide talking about stuff that we already saw in the demo, just about how the profiles are different, how it gets copied into the blueprint. Now let's talk about some failures that can happen in Apple Configurator. So we just saw one of those happen during the Prepare for Testing blueprint, but what if a failure happens during the Erase and Rename blueprint? Now I just said that that really shouldn't happen, but just in case it does, the thing to do is to put the device into recovery mode and try again. Now I'll talk a little bit more later about how to put devices into recovery mode, But assuming you know how to do that, put it into recovery mode, try the blueprint again in Apple Configurator, and it should work. If it doesn't, then you're probably dealing with a hardware issue, and that phone or iPad or iPod Touch is probably broken. And maybe you can repair it, or maybe you'll just pass it on to the next downstream vendor. So that's probably some bent board with some desoldered component or water damaged or something like that. Those are not issues that we deal with here at Free Geek. So usually those just get sent to Wireless Alliance for us. The next thing is these failures with the Prepare for Testing blueprint. Now I mentioned that that is going to be much more common because the Prepare for Testing blueprint is trying to activate the device. And activation can fail if a phone or a cellular iPad doesn't have a SIM card installed. That SIM card needs to be installed to activate. So sometimes if this activation fails, it's not always because it's activation locked. So first thing to do is to check the SIM tray to make sure you've got a SIM card in there. If you don't, just start trying different SIM cards. We have a collection of SIM cards from all the different carriers, so we'll just start plugging in SIM cards and tap through the setup screens manually to see if we can activate, and then if we can, then we'll rerun the Prepare for Testing blueprint so that we get all our apps installed and everything for testing. But if a device is activation locked, there's not really anything you can do easily. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But first, let's see what all this looks like on the device. Here we are in the next demo. So these are our two devices that we've been dealing with in Apple Configurator, and let's see what that looks like. So we're going to tap these on, click the home button, and we both get to the hello screen. That's good. That means they're both white. Now one starts on the language chooser and the other starts on the Wi-Fi chooser. So we know that the one on that has the Wi-Fi chooser is the one that the blueprint worked, and the one that's on the language chooser didn't get the Prepare for Testing blueprint installed. So let's see what that looks like. We've got to select our Wi-Fi network manually because it didn't learn it with the blueprint. Now I can't type that fast. I just trimmed a little bit away. Save some time, and let's see what this activation error looks like. So this is the activation lock screen. It shows up after Wi-Fi and before the location services screen would show up. So if you get to location services, then it's not activation locked. If you don't, then you'll probably see an activation error, and that's all we can do with this phone right now. So this already knew our Wi-Fi password. We just click next. We got to the location services screen. We enabled that. And now we can see that our home screen is all set up the way that we did in Apple Configurator. We've got setting, phone check, mobile assist light, and test M down in the dock. And let's see how test M looks. So you will need to sign into your account one last time, just one time for all the apps that you have installed. So this is just making sure, even though we had to put in our password in Apple Configurator, it's just making sure that whoever is using the device is allowed to use these apps. And now it's a pretty common, another little bug that might happen is sometimes these apps seem to stall a bit right after you log in. So the fix that I found is just click the home button, go out of the app, and then go back into it, and we'll see that it pretty quickly kicks into gear like it should have in the first place. And now we're in Test M. So we'll just tap through. I'll show you a little bit about all these apps. Not going to get into any crazy, not going to go through a full test or anything. So there's a full test and a quick test. We always do the full test that does everything you're going to see here. The touch screen, like I mentioned, speaker, earpiece, microphone, headphones, and then a bunch more of hardware, gyroscope, compass, etc. Bluetooth, like I mentioned, charger, light sensor, really like pretty much everything, every bit of hardware that the phone has. So this is that touchscreen test. I'm just gonna basically just touch every area to rub away these blocks. I'm moving quick, so I'm missing a bunch of stuff. That touchscreen is fine. Now let's check out this app, which I mentioned isn't very nice. We don't use it for much, but we've got the screen test here, the visual screen test. So we just tap, it'll start on black, and then you tap to switch through the different colors. So blue, green, yellow, red, white. And it's just to look really closely to see if there's any dark spots, light spots, or discoloration of any kind. And here's phone check. I mentioned very similar to test M. You can see it, different interface, but a lot of the same tests. It doesn't have Bluetooth, like I mentioned before, but it's optimized for iPad. So that's the one that we use on iPads to do the full touchscreen test. And now settings is useful to have in the dock because we're always going to want to go into the About section to see the capacity, the carrier, the IMEI number. Also, there's a model number that's useful that we put on our slips that's good for online sales. And then when we're done testing, we always go in and reset the device, which you'll see here in just a moment. So we go back to the general section, scroll down to the bottom, and click reset. You can see that profile is installed there. So when we do erase all content and settings through the phone, double confirm, erase iPhone, and that gets rid of everything. That gets rid of the profile we installed, the apps we installed. It does what I talked about before, destroying that encryption key to basically just set it back to factory original condition for the next user. Again, a very dense slide just showing everything that you just saw in that demo, just for your reference later on. Now I'm going to try to quickly cover a couple issues that you're guaranteed to run into, regrettably. The first of which is Apple's activation lock. And this is Apple's response to devices getting stolen. They wanted to make sure that if someone steals a device, that person can't really reuse it. It just makes it useless for somebody to steal it in the first place. So you may also hear this called iCloud locked or Find My iPhone, and that's because this is all features of iCloud, and activation lock is part of Find My iPhone. So if Find My iPhone is turned on, then activation lock is enabled. And that is a little weird because a lot of users don't realize that they're turning activation lock on when they turn on Find My iPhone, which gets offered to be turned on by default when you set up your phone and log into iCloud. I don't think this is bad because Apple's just trying to make sure that everybody stays protected, but this makes it harder for us because people don't realize that this is something that they need to turn off when they donate their phone to us. So that really has a big impact on what we can reuse and what we have to do to deal with that. I don't want to get too deep into this because we're running low on time, but one thing that we do to try to battle this is that we hand out flyers. You can take a look at this flyer. You can use it if you want. Please modify it because it has our email address on it for people to get in touch if they have any questions. But basically that has information on how somebody can go to iCloud.com and remove their device from their iCloud account remotely, turning off activation lock, allowing us to reuse that device. The other part is that we use these unique ID stickers, which you can read a little bit more about there, but I'm going to skip past for now to save some time. That's a way that we try to be able to get somebody's email address for the device that gets donated so we can track it back to their email, contact them, say, hey, please, can you disconnect this from your iCloud account so that we can reuse it? In short, it's a really big hassle. And sadly, if you can't contact the original owner of a device and its activation lock, there's nothing you can do. Apple can't do anything. You can't do anything. We can't do anything. That device is essentially a brick. It can be used for parts if it's got a good screen and you want to do screen swaps or something like that, but otherwise it cannot be reused as a whole. And now we're almost done. Just one more issue to talk about here, and this is Apple's USB restricted mode. This is a relatively newer feature that's Apple's response to some external hardware that can plug into a Lightning port and unlock a passcode protected iOS device by brute force. So it can somehow bypass Apple's restrictions on how quickly you can attempt different passcodes, and it can get into an iOS device apparently very fast. If it's got a 4 or 6 digit numeric passcode, it can apparently break through that in a matter of hours or a day or so. And so Apple's response was to turn the Lightning port into a power-only port after a device has been locked for a set amount of time. And this isn't that bad for users because it just means that if your device was locked for that amount of time, you just need to put in your passcode or use Touch ID or Face ID when you plug in an accessory. And in the past, in a few versions of iOS ago, this timeout was about a week. So if your device was locked for a week, then USB restricted mode would kick on and you would need to unlock it to use accessories. And then they shortened that down to an hour in the current version of iOS. So after your device is locked for an hour, you may see that you need to put in your passcode or unlock it to use accessories, but I've heard that in the latest, in the upcoming iOS 12, that USB restricted mode may become enabled immediately when a device is locked. So to use accessories from now on, essentially, people will have to put in their passcode. And this is for their own protection, but it is a bit of a hassle. It's not too bad for users, but it does throw a wrench in the kind of reuse we're doing, because when USB restricted mode is enabled, it means that when we plug a device into iTunes or Apple Configurator, that device doesn't show up on the computer at all. There is a message on the lock screen of the device saying unlock device to use accessories, but that's no help to us because we don't have the passcode and we don't want to go into people's devices. We just want to wipe them. And the only way that I found to deal with this is to put the device manually into recovery mode. And now I mentioned recovery mode a little bit earlier, talking about dealing with issues if you run into a problem with the erase and rename blueprint, but you'll probably be using recovery mode a lot more to deal with USB restricted mode. And here's a link at imore.com about how to put all the different devices into recovery mode. And most commonly, it's not that hard. You just hold down the home button while powering on the device. But for newer devices that don't have the same kind of home buttons or don't have any home button at all, there's different ways to put them into recovery mode. So that's why that link is handy there. So you can learn more about that on your own. We've got a little link down there at the bottom about the symptoms of USB restricted mode and how to deal with it. A lot of the same information you see here, but that's just for some reference later on. But I'm just going to try to push through because we're really low on time now. And finally, we're at the last slide of information. Here's a list of all the Macs that can run macOS Sierra. So if you want to use Apple Configurator or IPSW Updater, you're going to need one of these Macs or something newer. Also, I've got links to the USB charging stations that we use and the USB data hubs that we use. So we use separate charging stations to charge up devices more quickly than a data hub can do. And then once a device is charged to 50% or more, we move it over to our USB hubs that's plugged into an iMac, and we do all the stuff with Apple Configurator that you just saw. And that's all. Thank you so much for joining me for this presentation. Hopefully it's some useful information. And I hope we've got some time for questions, but if not, please email me at pico.mitchell@freegeek.org if you have any follow-up questions about this presentation, or if you run into any issues or have any ideas about IPSW Updater. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Pico. Again, this is Bud. Thank you very much. This webinar has been recorded, and at the completion of it, I'll compress it. Hopefully no later than tomorrow, I will have this sent out to everybody who is here on the webinar. Only one question came in, but it came in, I think, before you addressed the issue, and the question had to do with, is there any way to remove remote management or activation locks? I believe you already addressed that.
Yeah, with the remote management, I'm not positive if it's only was set up with remote management in Apple Configurator originally, which is probably what those schools are using. You may be able to put it into recovery mode and you can definitely wipe it, but if it's also activation lock, there's nothing to do about that. But like there are setups and things that can be done in Apple Configurator that can be removed later by wiping, but yeah, there's nothing to be done about activation lock.
Okay. No other question came in. However, 2 comments came in, and both of them said it was an excellent presentation and wanted to thank you for the time that you put into it. So that's pretty good. And another way of knowing when something is good, not a single person dropped out of the webinar. That's highly unusual in any kind of environment. So you had people's attention with the information. It was a lot of information. And the way you put it together and the fact that I'll be able to share this, I think it will be reusable, not just by the people who were in this webinar, but others who were unable to attend. I'll make sure they get it. So folks, make note, at least at this point, make note of Pico's contact information that's on the screen right now. It sounds like he would be willing to follow up with specific questions as they arise, as maybe you start exploring some of the information that he provided. So
yeah,
unless
absolutely.
any more,
and you may,
just
you may run into other issues that I didn't mention using Apple Configurator, so I can try to help with that if something comes up.
This is exactly what after it's supposed to be about, sharing best practices. And from the feedback we're getting here, Pico, this definitely was best practice. And a question did come in. Is there something similar for Android tablets and phones?
Not that I'm aware of, sadly, because there's so many different manufacturers. I've seen that there are some tools to wipe Android phones from a computer, but they'll be like specific to Samsung phones or specific to another manufacturer. And I haven't found anything like Apple Configurator to pre-configure phones. There may be stuff out there, but that's not really my expertise. And we've just kind of been trying to nail down this process. And for now, we're still doing Androids one at a time, usually wiping them through the devices themselves. And we'll be researching more. If we find any cool tools, we'll definitely share them. If you find anything, please share it with us.
That could be the subject matter of a future webinar. And let me wrap this up because we're at the 1 hour point. Oh, wait, there is one more question came in. Great. Let's see. I have to get back to the beginning of it here. It's all kind of, will this work on virtual machines, or does it all have to run off a physical Mac?
That's a good question. I haven't tried it off a virtual machine, but as long as the virtual machine software is sending the phones to that system, you know, you have your data hub plugged in, as long as the phones are connected to the virtual machine, I think it should work. Oh, you know, there's more complexity there, so maybe you'll run into different issues, but I believe that should be doable.
Great. All right. Well, let me, we're at the 1 hour point. Let me again thank everyone for coming. Thank Pico for his presentation. Thank Dan Bartholomew from FreeGeek for helping make this possible. And the last thing I want to say is there's lots of other great knowledge out there among AFTER members in many different subject matters pertaining to the technology, application, population served, et cetera, et cetera. If any of you on the line right now have an idea for a webinar that you'd like to share knowledge with as an individual or as a panel, please contact me. Email Rizer, R-I-Z-E-R, at Christina, CRISTINA.org, and we'll get together and we'll figure out what we can do. It's our pleasure as the backbone organization for AFTER to help get this information out to you. It's part of our function to help you guys communicate with one another. So on that note, Pico, again, thank you very much. Everybody have a great remainder of your week, and thank you all for the great work that you do.
Thank you.
All right.